Well, we'd like to welcome everyone here to another Sunday class from the BYU Library Family History Center. These presentations are recorded and put onto the BYU Library Family History Center website and also on their YouTube channel. So you can watch these videos at your leisure and learn a lot more. Right now on our YouTube channel, we're right around 1,000 videos. So it's quite a resource there. Today, we're going to talk about English records and English research. We're going to clarify a couple of things. First of all, Great Britain is the name of the island that is the home to the countries of England, Wales, and Scotland. And the United Kingdom is a country that is a union of the countries on the island of Great Britain, along with the country of Northern Ireland. And England is the country of England. So when we're talking about England, we're not talking about the United Kingdom and such, and we're not talking about Great Britain and such. We're talking about the area of the island that is called England. And that's just to clarify. And it's kind of a note for those doing research. One of the things I would suggest, very, very strongly suggest, is that you go back through the history of the name of England because it's quite long and quite involved. And you watch all the changes of when it went from England to the United Kingdom to the English Empire. All of these different things that happened over time have changed the name. And when you're entering entries into a program like Family Search or into even Ancestry or whatever else you're using, you may want to have a timeline that shows you the name that's appropriate to use for the time that the records are found. Now, the records have been entered. And so what happens here is that there's always a possibility that the people who are doing the cataloging of the records have cataloged them under different, either the right time period or an inaccurate time period for the one you're looking at. So it's easy to get mixed up there with whether it's UK or England and that's in itself or whatever it is, the United Kingdom or whatever. Okay. Science fiction author named Robert Heinlein said, "A generation which ignores history has no past and no future." I'm kind of worried about here in the United States. My brother taught history for years at the community college level, and his comments were always of frustration over the lack of any understanding whatsoever about history. And I periodically try that out on my grandchildren by asking them a question of like, when was the American Civil War and things like that. And it's surprising. Sometimes they do know a little bit, but most of the time, what they do know is very limited. And I think that's kind of general now. And so maybe we've lost if we continue to lose our past, we may lose our future. The country of origin is very important for you to understand this. This is the origin of the historic European population of the United States. Since we're here in the United States, we can consider these people who come here to be immigrants and foreigners. Well, the biggest number of people that we have in the country from other countries is from Germany. And in Germany, it's about 14% of our American population has German ancestry, and about a 10% has Italian ancestry. And then we get down to Great Britain, and about 10% has Great Britain ancestry, and of course Ireland, and then on down the list here. And you might be surprised at some of these that have either very large or very small or very considerable populations here in the United States. What we need to start out with English research is an English timeline. This timeline is very general, and it talks about the dates that will affect the records. In other words, it's records that we're concerned with, not merely big historical events. So even though we have something like a world war does generate records, but it's not where we would think about as a record generating activity. In other words, it's just because there are records from that. So there's generally records from wars, and there's generally records from when there are no wars. But there are times at which these records become important. And the first one we need to understand is the Doomsday Book, and that's back in 1085. Why is that important? Well, because it's the first attempt that we have written that records a significant number of people. Previous records and records that, and even subsequent to 1085, focus primarily on royalty and some nobility. And the difference between royalty is kings and the kings and queens' families, and nobility is everybody else. It's all the dukes and the other people out there. And the Doomsday Book basically recorded a lot of the not so common people, but more people than had been recorded previously. And it's also important for us to understand that it wasn't until 1477 that the first printed book, was done in England. Now, why is this important? It's because previous to that, all of the records that we have are on manuscripts. They're on vellum or some kinds of paper. Not too many are on paper. They're mostly on other substances. And they're basically individual documents or collections of documents. And there are very, usually have a lot of pictures on them and things back in medieval manuscripts, but they are not very helpful for genealogy purposes in most cases. When we jump forward quite a few years, we end up with the Act of Union, and that's where we get the first time that England is with something besides itself. It joined England and Wales. And so that's an important date for us to know, because that's the date. Before that date, Wales was a separate country and England was a separate country. After that date, they are essentially the same country, but not completely absorbed in each other even today. And then the next big date that we have is a couple of years later, and that's in 1538, when King Henry VIII separates from the Catholic Church. Now, why is this significant? It's because he indirectly and through his staff or whatever of the king, he ordered all of the parishes to start keeping records of birth, marriages, and deaths. And not deaths, excuse me, birth, marriages, and burials. And so that's the official earliest date of records that are consistently talk about the common people, the people that probably most of us are descendants from. It's okay if you are a descendant of a royal line or a noble line, but most of us are going to find out that we're pretty much part of the ordinary people in England. 1707, it's quite a leap, is when the Kingdom of Great Britain established, when Scotland joined the Kingdom of England and Wales. So Great Britain, Kingdom of Great Britain, is what they call it from 1707 forward. And then the United Kingdom is in 1801. So that was when the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. And I'm going to do the next slide I do is going to talk about Ireland, and that's even more complicated, but I'm doing that because I think it's important to clarify that when we're talking about English records. 1837, beginning of civil registration in England and Wales. Civil registration was first implemented by Napoleon, but it was copied by most of the countries in Europe and even a lot of the countries in Latin America and other places, not the United States. The United States has resisted civil registration for a variety of reasons. The closest thing we have to civil registration is Social Security, presently. The only other types of registration are driver's licenses, which is pretty well covered the whole country. But as an official civil registration, and they are birth, marriages, and deaths. So I'll come back to that too. So understanding that there are limits. So if you're looking for civil registration records in England, they start in 1837. So there's no records before 1837. If you're looking for parish records in England, there are almost none before 1538. And so you'd be lucky if you find anything before 1538. But it's not like magically everybody decided to do what the king ordered, and they had to wait until Queen Victoria came along and indicated that she would basically cut off their heads if they didn't do the records, metaphorically, I hope. But anyway, that incentivized everybody to get their records done. In 1841, we find the first complete census of England, Scotland, and Wales. So that's where we start getting records that not only help us find individuals, as in the mid area of the 1800s, but also find complete families. Parish registers are very, very, very helpful, but they seldom give you a complete family. Both civil registration gives you individual records mostly, but when we finally get to census records in England, then we have complete families. And I tossed in 1845 to 52 because that's the kind of the main issue with the Irish potato famine, and well over 1 million people from Ireland came to America during that short period of time, and many after that, and some quite a few before. Okay, but I thought I was going to throw in just to give you an overview real quick here of the dates having to do with Ireland, because there's a lot of confusion about that. Now, why is this in with England records? Well, because Ireland was part of England in the United Kingdom. And in that case, we are looking at English records when we look at Irish records, in a sense. They're kept on the church level. Of course, they were Catholic records, and they're just very different from the records that were kept in England, which were primarily Protestant records, but in the Church of England after King Henry. So, but there's some understanding of these time frames is extremely important, because it helps you understand how the English records work. And if you do have people from Ireland, then it's important to know this, because this may affect where and how you find the records. So you look at the dates here. The main date is 1921, 1919 to 1921. The War of Independence, they call it, from 1919 to 1921, began in the 1600s. And between 1600 and 1900, the Irish were constantly at battle with Britain. So the British Isles and Ireland didn't see eye to eye even from the 1600s. But in 1921, Ireland got established as the Irish Free State. And then the Irish Free State, after 10 months of a transitional period, became, because of the 1936 External Relations Act, the British monarch no longer had any effect on Ireland. And then in 1948, Ireland declared itself to be a republic and removed any of the remaining role of the king. And then in 1949, they declared they were no longer part of the British Commonwealth. And that also clarified the status of Northern Ireland, which remained part of the UK. So Northern Ireland and Ireland itself are now separate countries, and they are our Northern Ireland is a country belonging to the United Kingdom, and Ireland itself is a separate autonomous country. Okay, now we need to talk about some of the basics of doing the research when you're working with these records. What kinds of things do you do first, and what do you do second? First of all, I would suggest that you spend some time learning about research in England. There are lots of videos like this one, probably will be, and there are other sources, which I'll go through quite a few of these as I work through this presentation. The one thing that you need to know in order to get started any place is a name, a date, and a specific location for an event in an ancestor's life. So one of the things that I think happens too frequently among genealogists and that I deal with is that they kind of bow to the allure of doing genealogical research back in the early days. Oh, we want to do research in the 1600s and back into the 1500s. And that sounds really interesting. And the problem, of course, is that there's an exponential increase in the difficulty as you go back in time, not just from the difficulty of reading the records themselves, but because the language changes. No, it ceases to be English as we know it and becomes another language called Middle English and then Old English, which is even more different from modern English. So we really kind of have to be careful as we jump way back, and especially if you're just starting out, jumping back into the early 1800s and even in the 1700s is going to be something that's really kind of specific and kind of difficult. And so you need to keep in mind that when you're looking at these records and the names and things, that you need to have a name and a date and a location. The easiest way to start genealogy is to start with yourself, because you probably know your name. You probably know something about when you were born, or at least you know now you're living. And a specific location for an event means you know when you got married or when you got baptized or when you got some event in your life that had a date recorded. So those are the kinds of things that we need to start with. Then look for the places on Google Maps and use Street View if it's available. The best thing to start out to do is every time you hear about a new place is do some real quick research on the place. Find out how big it is, when it was established, when it became what it is today. And I can assure you that just doing that simple fact of putting it on a map and looking it up on the Google search or an Edge search or whatever you want to use, is that you'll save yourself some grief in the future. And look for records in each of the large and online database websites. Okay, so one of the problems we have is that we start out working on a program like Family Search or Ancestry or Find My Past or My Heritage, and we get to know that program, we're comfortable with it, and we like it, and we forget that there are all these other programs out there. And it is important, and at least in the beginning sense, to be able to use all four of those large programs, plus many other online resources, to get information and learn how to use them and how to gain access to them before you get too far in doing genealogical research. And then make sure you enter all the information you find in your sources into Family Search, Family Tree, or whatever other program you choose. It's important that as you do your research, you record it. There's a suggestion out there in the genealogical community of having what are called research logs. Well, if you're careful enough, you can keep a research log on Ancestry or on Family Search of all the records you look at. But on the other hand, there's also an opportunity to use that online or do it on a spreadsheet or whatever other way is important for you to understand what you're doing. And then always go back and review for correctness and add all correct record heads. One of the things that's important as I do these presentations, for example, is I go through and I do the presentation, and then I have prevail upon my wife to sit down there and look at it. She's a proofreader and an English major and taught English. And so when she goes through it, she finds all my mistakes. And so we can then correct them. But even then, when both of us have read it, there's still times when I notice that there's an occasional period or something out of place. So we really have to be careful when we're doing correct records for genealogy. Then just repeat. In other words, we learn more, we keep knowing about the specific locations for an event in a person's life. We look for the location first, then we learn about the records that are available, then we extract all the information we find, and that we review it. And that's kind of the general research process that goes over and over and over again. Another important understanding is that a jurisdiction is an area governed by a system of laws. And that's what I was kind of, before we started, I was mentioning that in England, they've redone their whole kind of organizational system in the last, well, they started many years ago, but more recently. So what we generally see on a map are the historic counties. We see all these different counties like Exeter and Northampton and Cambridge and Ipswich and all these things. But what happens now in real life is that these historic counties have become traditional or ceremonial, in a sense, counties, and they no longer have any basis. Unfortunately, that doesn't help us because a lot of the genealogical records are historic and are cataloged by the historical counties. So even though now in the present the organization has changed, the key to that is that many of the records in England are actually kept on the national level, and there are still records being kept at the church levels in the church parishes as opposed to the civil parishes. So here's when you have to go, when you're working with the records in England, you're going to find that there's a lot to do with the counties, and these are the historic counties of England, of which there are 48. And so what you're looking at is a map here of the counties. Now, let's suppose that as you're working, doing your research, you find a person that you suspect is your ancestor and they live in Lancashire. And then you are finding children and, and here's the parents' names and everything's the same and the dates and all of this information is the same, except these people happen to be in Hampshire. Now, if you're doing research without doing what I suggested, and that is to go through and look at all the geographic areas and on a map and understand what you're looking at, you may not realize that there's a difference between Lancashire and Hampshire. Lancashire is up in the north, and it's not the furthest north, but it's a fairly large way north. And Hampshire is clear down on the south end of England. And as you go back in time, the fact that somebody could have an event that occurred in both those two counties begins to become almost impossible. And so basically, this is the way that we differentiate between, and you need to be kind of aware of this as this general county organization. And it might be helpful to study a map and learn a little bit about each of the counties, which is very, very interesting. And you'll find out there's a lot of information on each of these counties. Now, one way to get started without going any place that costs any money or has any real difficulty in accessing is the Family Search Research Wiki. And the wiki has an extraordinary amount of information about England genealogy. And it's obviously one of the areas that genealogists here in the United States spend a lot of time with. And so the Research Wiki reflects that. And there are getting started resources, there are research tools, there's lists of records, there's explanations of everything in the world. And so using the Research Wiki as a basis for your initial study of what's happening in English records is easy, accessible, and free. So it's be a good place to start as far as understanding it. Now, one of the sources that is exceptionally helpful and spends its time moving around on the Family Search website, and presently the last time I checked was not on the website itself, is the England 1851 map. And there's a couple of ways you can get to that. You can look up England and Wales parish map, and then with Family Search, say Family Search England and Wales parish map, and that'll get you to it. Or you can look at maps.familysearch.org, and it will take you to this map. So what does this map do? It goes through in great detail about every single county and gives you the dates that all the records are available, the dates that you can expect to find records, lists all the parishes in the counties, lists all the contiguous counties, and lets you search the family library catalog, family history library catalog, and search the Family Search Research Wiki, and you can remove whatever you've done. And it's a very, very, very helpful. The next most valuable record for understanding these historical counties is the Philimore's Atlas and Index of Parish Registers. Now, as you go back in time in England, it's rather let's say you're incentivized to continue to go back and back and back in time. But you need to understand the limitations of what you've done. When you start getting back in time to a certain level in any given county in England, you'll find that it's just they never quit. It's all the end of the records. There aren't any more records. You're not going to find anything in the websites or any place. Even going to the counties themselves, you're not going to find records before a certain date. Well, this is what Philimore's Atlas and Index of Parish Registers does. It tells you any update in the, because it's the 2003 version on Ancestry, and it tells you the date of the registration of the earliest records, and also tells you information about any updates or changes to that as either more records became available or whatever happens in the area. It's not going to be a lot of changes, believe me. It's not a lot of that information. But this is another, what you would call the basic one. And if you look over on the side of related data collections on this, when you get to the Philimore's, if you look this up on Ancestry, you can find it under Philimore's Atlas and Index. But you can go here on the right-hand side, and it shows you that there's other information, maps and things that are valuable and helpful. Is one of the things you'll find is that in the United States, if you have a town by a place called Mountain View, you can make sure that there's probably a Mountain View in every single state that has mountains. And even in some states that don't have mountains, they'll still have a mountain view for some reason. Anyway, the reason I'm referring to that is because Phoenix has mountain view, and you can only see, right now it's very occasional that you can actually see the mountains because of the smog. But anyway, it's a kind of a distant idea if you're really thinking that's a mountain view, especially from where they're called, you can't see anything. But that's an important point, because until you get into the gazetteers and the atlases and the maps, you don't realize that there are a lot of places in England with the same name. And so they can have the same name in two or three or even four or five different counties. And that makes it very difficult because you may find a record that doesn't specify the county, but says the place they came from. And then you have to worry about whether this is really your person, because it may not be in the same county. And this is what I referred to just a little bit earlier. This is the Local Government Act of 1972. And what they created was a two-tier metropolitan and non-metropolitan county and district councils. So basically, they restructured the way that the government operated in England almost entirely between 1972 and 1974. Anything you find that's post 74 mentioning counties or areas in or districts may be or parishes or whatever, that's all going to be civil and not necessarily, unless you specifically focus on the church records, you might be misled into thinking you're looking at a parish record that are trying to find parish records, and you may not see that they have the same kinds of records on the parish level that you're looking for. And one thing that I would encourage everyone to do is to remember that there are books in the library. When you go into like the BYU Library Family History Center is in the middle of a huge university library. The resources of the library are extraordinary, and the books and the reference materials are just amazing. And yet I have people come in there constantly and sit down in front of a computer and simply use all the resources on the computer, but never look at the books and never understand what kind of help that the books may be to them individually. And sometimes the questions they're asking me or discussing requires, if I'm in the library, it requires a very short walk over to the reference shelves and pointing out the fact that there's a whole set of books here that have the information that you're looking for. Of course, you could go online, and this book may be digitized, and you may be able to find the information. But in a lot of cases, that's not the case. That the books are valuable and have information and organization that you're not going to find easily when looking on the computer. And this is a good example. This is one that I would start out with, and you can get this online. It's a book. It's actually a book. It's actually about 600 pages long and in that range, and it is exhaustive as to when they say the complete guide, I'm assuming it's complete. I don't have any way to find out if it's not complete, but it has enough information in here is that there's not very many other places that you're going to have to go to get the records. And if you go online, like on Amazon, you can find this book already. Just put in Ancestral Trails and it'll come up. And what you do, and it's by Mark Herr down there. So basically, this kind of thing, it's going to be interesting that it's not the kind of book you're going to sit down and read from cover to cover. You might. I've done that kind of thing with these books before. This book turns out to be more of a reference book. But when you're reading about records and when you've said you're finally getting out of it and you hear about a record, then this book will help you to explain where and how those records were collected, where they might be available, and the information that you might be able to get from the records. So there's a reason to get into these things. There's another really good help here. It's the fhguide.com, the Family History Guide. The Family History Guide has step-by-step instructions to not only to England, but into every single county in England, all the counties here. and they will tell you the basic information about the records and civil registration and the censuses and the probates and the church and all of the records. So if you worked through the Family History Guide, you would have a substantial basis for beginning to do the research and being able to be more effective in your research if you are already in the midst of doing English research. And then I suggest using all of the large online websites as I did in the past. Commonly, people say, well, don't they have all the same records? Well, in a sense, some of them do. They may have all of these these websites may have the English census records, and all of them may have the U.S. Census records and some other things like that. But when you get into these collections, they're far from identical. They have records. For instance, Find My Past has records for England that are not available in any of the other three big websites. And the same can be said of MyHeritage and Ancestry and Family Search. The two records over on the corner are the UK BMD, that's Birth, Marriages, and Death and Censuses on the internet, and that is kind of a key to getting into those records directly in England rather than being on one of these large websites, and may have more information than is on the big websites. The National Archives, of course, is the National Archives, and they are the main repository for records in the country, along with the General Register Office that we'll talk about. And if you go to the National Archives, then it will explain to you how the records work and when they're available and how they're organized and how it was compiled. So the National Archives is I would venture to say that doing genealogical research or being genealogists in England is probably, I would say, not light years, but very significantly greater interest in England in genealogy and involvement than there is in the United States, any place in the United States. And so you're really running into a situation where a lot of the records are already set up to be used by or have been created by genealogists. And so they're basically out there to help us all to do our research. So here's the National Archives. I would suggest clicking through. There's help with your research. There's research guides. And then you can go through and see how to access the records. Now, there's one thing that's interesting about the National Archives that you need to know. And that is that when you look for a record on the National Archives, they have an index. They'll show you a record, and that may be the record you think you need, but unfortunately, you have to pay to see the actual record itself. And so, that sounds interesting. And right now, I don't remember, it's somewhere in the neighborhood of £6 or £8 or so pounds to have a copy of a record. And, unfortunately, that's the way it works. And some of the people that I know who, by the way, would have the wherewithal to do that, have basically, whenever they find a record they need, they simply order it, and they have piles and stacks of these records that they have obtained for doing their research. The UK BMD, now going back into that a little bit, this is a volunteer effort in England, and the volunteers basically collect, collate, and transcribe records for various parishes. You'll see a reference to the OPC. The OPC is the Online Parish Clerks websites. And there are a number of online parish clerks websites. So when you get to the parish you're looking for, you look for the online parish clerk website for your ancestor, and you would then have probably get more records. In other words, you may not have everything on Ancestry and Family Search and Find My Past, And you may find that the online parish clerks have copied out the records that you need. So this is, this is a great website, and it's useful for the research that when you get into records that it starts to be, well, I don't really know if this person is the same person as this person because they do it. And the simple thing is that names are in England are common. They're not as common as Scandinavia or other places that I know. Latin America is pretty common in old records, but English is their share of records that where everybody has the same name. That's one of the hard things to get into. And then there's another website, parishregister.co.uk, and that is for tracing your family tree before 1837. And that gets as far as the records will go on any of those parish registers. Some of these websites you can expect to have, there are some of them paywall. In other words, you have to not only sign in but register and pay a fee. Other ones you may have to pay a fee per document if you're ordering actual documents, and so it's more of a that there's going to be possibility of having to pay for more records here. At this point, what I thought it would be important is just to kind of review the basic record sets. And these are names of records that are generally available. And you can see that I start out with civil registration and census records because those are the ones you'll want to begin with as you get your initial people, if they were anywhere up in the 20th century or the 19th century, particularly if their life extended past 1850, there's an almost certain chance that they will show up in a British census record. Okay, so then you have church records. They come in 4 different categories. They come in bishops' transcripts, which are done by the diocese with the bishop, and the bishop transcripts are copies of records in the parish. So if the parish has somehow lost these records, the next step is to go see if the diocese has a copy of the records. And a lot of the records you'll find on Family Search turn out to be diocese records rather than parish records. Then there are marriage records, marriage indexes, and what we have called nonconformist records. The nonconformist is a category of anyone who did not belong to the Church of England. So anybody who was a Baptist, Methodist, any of those other sects would be a nonconformist. And if there are records, then they would be in the nonconformist records. And you may not guess that your people are nonconformists until you find out that they're impossible to find in the parish registers, and then you realize they may not even been members of the Church of England. There are deed registers, which are lists of people, probate records by county, London, poor law records. Poor law records are very interesting because they pick up some of the people that you would otherwise miss because they were too poor to show up in any other kind of record. And my ancestors, for example, were so poor that they were in Herefordshire, and the county refused to have a poorhouse. They didn't want to support the poor. But the country, England, decided to help the counties out. So they created a way by which the poor people could apply and be shipped off to Australia. Well, they've been doing that for years, fight for criminals, so they just switched over to poor people, and the poor people were shipped over. And 3 of my family's lines were shipped to Australia. And so they kind of intermarried and ended up in the United States, but still have a lot of relatives in Australia. Migration records, internal migration records, external migration, and records of enslaved people. So possible record categories that you'll find in the in the records themselves. Now it's important to understand the census years on all of these. First of all, the England and Wales census was from 1841 to 1921. The 1921 census is available right now only on Find My Past because they have a contract with the government to have that. Scottish census, 1841 to 1911. Northern Ireland, understanding that the Irish census records before 1861 were destroyed in the Irish Civil War in 1922. And when the record, the archives in Belfast was blown up by a bomb. So in Northern Ireland, there are fragments of the 1821, 1831, and 1851 censuses, but the 1851 is the key one for getting information about families. Next, we have what's called the General Register Office, and these are birth, deaths, and marriages records. And once again, it's the same issue here. You look it up, you find the person, you see that the marriage record, or you see the birth record. And if you want a copy of the record, which may have more information than is in the index, then you have to pay for the record. So it's the same kind of pay thing. This is something that just really helps, is really helpful, is a topographical dictionary. Now, this is online. This basically tells you about all the different places, parishes, and counties. And so it's kind of a way to find that, but you can do those searches online. And I would suggest also using an AI program like Google's Gemini or Microsoft's Copilot, because they're becoming, for me, they're becoming very helpful in tracking down information on the counties. Now, if you're talking about going into records that you believe that show that you are the royalty, if your family was in the colonies, in the English colonies, it's called gateway families. Those are the gateway families, are those who have ancestors who were in, the general term is peerage, meaning European royals, English royals. And if you're in the nobility, by the way, and you're a descendant in the nobility, you know it. I would have to say that it's probable that you already know that your great-great-grandfather was a king, because you will know that from your family. But if we're talking about nobility, then that's not something that you basically might know about. And so this is one way. And using these websites, which are become exhaustive in understanding and finding out accurate information on the royal families, is important. This is another one, the Genealogist, and this is a subscription program, and you can search in a variety of different ways. And there's some records that are here that are not found anyplace else. And it's another one of those British records sets. And I just have to say that there's many other places and other sources for British records. That big book on ancestral trails is just packed full of all the different types and all the different kinds of records that have been kept over the years in England. Of course, access and availability are two extremely important things. Sometimes the records, you can know about the record existing, but finding out that there's some place where you can access the record is important. Now, ultimately, if you are overly interested, you can always do like my daughter and her husband did on occasion, and that is they love to travel, and they are avid genealogists at the very high level of proficiency, probably some of the best in the country on English genealogy. And they basically traveled over to the parish where a lot of our ancestors came from, I walked into the parish and negotiated and said, "Can we take pictures of your parish register?" And they said, "Sure." And so they sat there all day taking pictures and gathered in all the records they needed. I guess that's something that could be possible if you have the means and have the courage to go in and do that. This is the Oxford University. If you watch British mystery movies on the videos, I would assume that you'd know have seen the Oxford University on a few of the British mystery shows. Okay, well, thanks for watching, and let's see if there's any questions. How accurate is Relative Finder? Only as accurate as the family search family tree, which I say is not very accurate, so I wouldn't believe it.